There are a lot of books about money. So when The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel started popping up in my feed, I was a bit hesitant. Do we need another book about money? But I read it last year and I loved it so much that I want to share my 5 favorite lessons from the book. 5 powerful lessons that are changing the way that I interact with money and honestly life in general. Let's dive in. Lesson 1. We act on our experience. Have you ever had the experience of trying to explain a certain technology to someone who is older than you? Or perhaps you yourself have asked someone much younger than you to explain something new. If you grew up with a smartphone, it might seem unfathomable to you to find yourself logged out of your email with no way to get back in. But depending on when you were born, your experience with technology can vary greatly. And when it comes to our finances, it's the same story. What I believe sets this book apart from so many others is that Housel points out that our view of money is impacted more by what we live through than by what we might learn from reading a book or taking a course. There is something that happens when we live through the anxiety of a particular financial experience that can't be taught or replicated. This is why so many people panic sell when markets begin to crash. It's easy to think long term when the markets are doing well, but when the market begins to crash, all of a sudden our time horizons begin to shrink. And if you've lived through a time in your life where you're living hand to mouth and struggling to put food on the table, then your relationship with money is going to be very different than someone who's never experienced that. Now, Housel talks about how all these different experiences can impact our relationship with money, but most specifically, what we live through in our early adult years really impacts our decision making going forward. So if your early adult years are marked by high inflation and high unemployment, you're going to see the world very differently than someone who lives through the opposite. Or if your young adulthood is marked by rapidly rising housing costs, then your experience in investing or buying a home might be quite different than someone that was able to purchase a home maybe in the early 1990s. So if someone makes a financial decision that seems completely irrational to you, just remember that they're basing that decision on their own life experience up to that point. Lesson 2. Don't ignore chance. At the age of 13, Bill Gates attended one of the very few schools that had a computer in 1968. Now, Housel runs through a bunch of numbers in his book, and he estimates that there is a 1 in a million chance that Bill Gates ends up at that school with that type of access to a computer. And even Gates himself attributes a lot of his success to this fact. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Gates wasn't extremely smart and obviously very driven, but we often forget the importance of chance when it comes to success, mostly because it's really difficult to quantify and really challenging to explain. But what Housel points out that I found really helpful in my own life, he says, instead of looking to emulate specific people, we should focus on patterns. Housel talks about how hard it is to emulate Warren Buffett's success. But when we step back and we look at the investment strategy of others that also have a really long-term view, we can begin to recognize patterns of financial success that can be helpful to us. I believe this lesson is very applicable not just to finance, but to so many other areas of life. Don't study the extreme characters looking to emulate them. Look for patterns. I'm super excited to announce that today's video is sponsored by Shortform. Look, I read a lot of books, but one of the things that I've struggled with in the past is reading a book, loving it, putting it back on the shelf, and then almost completely forgetting what I just read. Thankfully, I was recently introduced to Shortform. The best way I can describe it is it's like having a powerful book summary in your pocket, but it's on steroids. They give you access to over 1,000 best-selling books in categories like leadership, health, business, and finance, like we're talking about today. I actually use Shortform to help pull this video together. Not only are the summaries really well put together, but they also add what they call smart insights, where they take what one author is thinking about the topic that you're reading about and tying it right into the summary. And they're constantly adding new titles. So if you have books that you've read before and want a refresher, or if you're like me and you have a big list of books that you look forward to learning more about, maybe before you buy a copy, this will be a great asset for you. You can head over to shortform.com/Jason and they will give you a free trial and a 20% off your annual membership. We'll put a link in the show notes for you as well. Let's get back to the video. Lesson 3. History doesn't predict the future. History is history for a reason. It's marked by a series of surprising and unpredictable events. And yet that rarely stops us from trying to use history as a tool to predict the future. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Humans are hardwired to hate uncertainty. So we like to use history to help us build a story of what we believe the future will look like. But the issue is this rarely works. specifically when it comes to our finances. Nobody could have predicted the outlier events like the COVID-19 pandemic or September 11th, both of which had major financial implications. When you combine this with the fact that our financial structures are changing so rapidly, we need to be really cautious about what type of financial advice that we take, even if it's as old as 20 years ago. We'll touch on this a little bit more in lesson number 5, but Morgan Housel suggests 3 things to keep in mind when we're looking at financial advice. Number 1 is always check the date. Number 2 is to look for patterns in behavior. And number 3 is to always be willing to pivot in a rapidly changing world. Lesson 4, stop the goalpost from moving. 2 of the most valuable things that money can buy is time and flexibility. And both of these things can lead to a more fulfilling and generally happy life. But how much money do you actually need? While Housel never gives a specific number, that's kind of an impossible thing to answer, he does encourage us to find a way to be happy with enough. For me personally, I was always taught to live well below my means, keeping my expenses well below my income, being a good steward of all the financial blessings in my life. And what Housel recommends is that we need to find a way to stop increasing our lifestyle standards as our income increases. Just because you make more money doesn't mean that you need a bigger house, a better car, or a fancier vacation. In a world that is being driven by comparison, there will always be someone that has more than you. But if you can find a way to have enough, to identify what enough is to you, then comparison doesn't matter. Now, if you're having trouble identifying what enough is for you, Housel recommends that you dig in and identify your values. And if you're looking to discover your values, I did a video very specifically to that point a couple of weeks ago. I highly recommend you check it out after this video. Lesson 5, plan for things to go wrong. Growing up, I was often taught to build up an emergency fund or a buffer account, something there for when things don't go as you planned. Housel takes it a step further by saying that we should be planning for things to go wrong. And he says that we oftentimes are a little bit too optimistic with our finances. We convince ourselves that that story we're telling ourselves about the future, we convince ourselves that that story is true. But just like we talked about, there are always going to be outlier events. But by knowing this, we can plan for them and hopefully lessen the blow. So his advice is to never put all of your finances at risk with a singular investment and to always keep your emergency fund high. Life is going to happen to all of us. Some of it will be good, some of it will not. It's our job to plan for both. Now, Morgan also touches on other tactics, such as how powerful compounding is and the importance of savings. But that isn't what really sets this book apart. It's all about the psychology of money.